Good morning. Wow, a bit subdued here this morning. Good morning. Good morning. That's better, isn't it? How is everyone? All right? It is a glorious autumn morning, isn't it? Absolutely gorgeous, the weather at the moment. Really enjoying that. So glad you're with us this morning. My name's Brian, and it's my privilege to share God's word this morning. If you have a Bible with you, whether that's on a device or hard copy, we are going to be in 2 Kings chapter 13 this morning. What do you prefer? Do you prefer the beginning of something or the end of something? The beginning of a season or the end of a season? It strikes me that we're just moving into autumn, aren't we? So we've just stepped out of summer. Are you more excited about looking back on the summer season that we just stepped out on, or are you more excited about the stepping into the autumn season? I think maybe, I'll speak for myself here, not everyone else, but most of us, right, we're probably more excited about stepping into a new season, right? Because that's exhilarating and the anticipation and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, stepping out of a season is also good, right? Because hopefully we can look back and see with some satisfaction that season that we were in. Of course, that's not always true. Sometimes that season, you know, that we're stepping out of didn't go quite as the way that we anticipated, the way that we hoped. The author of Ecclesiastes says that better the end of a thing than its beginning. So maybe that's his perspective, right? Sometimes, you know, things even have a shaky start, but then you think, oh, I don't know about stepping into this season, but it turns out all right. I was thinking back a long time ago now to the first job that I had after I left school. And I worked on this nursery because I was going into the horticultural business. And so I went and worked for this man called Mr. Van Delft, bless you. And Mr. Van Delft, as you may gather by his name, was a Dutchman. And Mr. Van Delft had grown up in what was then the Dutch East Indies. And when he was a child, it had been during the Second World War, and the Dutch East Indies had been invaded by Japan, and he'd actually been in a camp during his childhood. And so that had had an effect on him, and he was a tough man. You have to be tough to survive that kind of stuff. And he had expected all his employees to be like just as tough as him, right? And so here am I, and I fetched up, and he thought that I was not tough. He thought I was soft, in fact. And so for the first few months as I worked on this nursery, I wasn't allowed near a plant. In fact, my job was to mix concrete. And then after I'd mixed the concrete, I had to wheelbarrow the concrete down to where it was being laid. And that was my life. And I was thinking, well, this is kind of rough. It's not really what I was expecting, but we'll keep going, right? And then things came to a head one afternoon where, again, this was like an old place, and it wasn't really very mechanized, and we got this 10 tons of sand that was delivered, and the lorry, the truck, couldn't dump it in the hopper because it couldn't get there, so you had to wheelbarrow it about 20 yards from where it was dumped to where the hopper was, right? And guess who got that job on a Friday afternoon? That was me, right? And so there I am, you know, doing my thing, trying to get it done before 5 o'clock and quitting time. And out the corner of my eye, I see Mr. Van Delft come down to where I am. And I'm thinking, oh no, what does he want? And he starts having a go at me and says, well, Brian, why don't you just quit? Why don't you just give up? Why don't you just quit? What are you doing here? And I was like, well, I'm not going to quit. You can sack me, but I'm not going to quit. And so we had this conversation that went backwards and forwards like this for about 5-10 minutes. Why don't you, you just need to quit. No, you can sack me, but I'm not going to quit. And then he went off again, right? And at 5 o'clock, knocking off time, I was really expecting that he was going to sack me. But he didn't. And then I came back to work the following week, or Monday morning, And suddenly everything had changed. No longer was I mixing concrete and pushing wheelbarrows full of stuff around the place, but I was actually got to do like plant stuff and horticulture, which is kind of what I was signed up for. And it turned out that it was a test, right? And the test was, would I be tough enough? And I guess I was. In fact, when I left a year later to go to college after that, we were pretty good friends, in fact, and we got along great. And I look back on that season in my life, actually, with a lot of fondness. And I think about Mr. Van Delft, and I'm eternally grateful to him because he gave me like this work ethic. He taught me what it was like to resilience, right? To stick through something and keep going. And that has really served me well all my life. We're in this series called Standing in the Gap. And we're at the end of this series. Actually, we're about to leave it. And we've been looking at the life of Elisha, who is somebody else who has made a mark in my life. Maybe he's made a mark in your life the last 7 weeks or so. And it started off for this series, we may remember that we talked about Elisha stepping in, right, into this season where he was going to be a prophet. And he was following this man, Elijah, who was kind of a tough man. In fact, Elijah had kind of wanted him to quit, right? Before Elijah took off from this earth. Not take off literally, but before God took him away. And he tried to get rid of him, in fact. But Elisha had refused, and Elisha had been there at the end when Elijah had been taken up into heaven, and Elisha had asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Not so that Elisha could outdo Elijah, but so that he could step into the gap that Elijah had left behind. And that's great, right? And we've seen over the last 7 weeks or so how God gave it to Elisha. But now it's time for Elisha himself to step out. It's time for Elisha to leave the role that he had been given. And you might be thinking this morning, well, that's great, Brian, but what's all that got to do with me? Because I'm just got here and I'm just stepping into my role. Maybe I've just stepped into a new season of life. So what has all that got to do with me? Well, that's fine, right? But seasons are seasons, aren't they? And we step in one end, but sure enough, at some point, no matter how long or short it might be, we're going to have to step out on the other side. And it's kind of important to know how to step out well. So that's kind of what we're talking about this morning. Emily, is going to come up and she's going to read 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 14 through 21. Sorry, Emily.
Now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, draw the bow, and he drew it. And Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands, and he said, open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have made an end of them. And he said, take the arrows, and he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground with them. And he struck 3 times and stopped. Then the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times. So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And as a man was being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet.
Elisha hasn't been exhaustive of everything that Elisha did. I kind of fitted it into 7 weeks. We missed out a few things, right? And, it's tempting, isn't it, to think of Elisha as kind of just a kind of friendlier version of Elijah, right? That's kind of what we talked about. Elijah was like this tough loner man, right, that Elisha was following. But Elisha's not really like that. We've seen, he was involved with company of prophets. Not only that, but he was actually involved with the king of Israel, right? And the king of Israel was not a great godly man by any means. So, Elisha was much more friendly. In fact, there was one story we left out where not only did Elisha minister to the king of Israel, but the king of Israel, the king of Edom, and the king of Judah, when they were on like this joint expedition to go against the Moab. Yeah, that's right. And they kind of run into some difficulties in the wilderness, and 7 days they've been without water, and so they go and find Elisha to help them out, right? Elisha, he's kind of dismissive of the king of Edom and the king of Israel, but he says, well, Jehoshaphat, because you're king of Judah, I have some regard for you, so I'll give you a hand, right? And that's this other story, which is kind of an odd little story, where after Elisha first steps in to be a prophet, he's walking through this town, and this group of lads come down, and they start taking the mickey out of him. And they actually call him Baldy, right? Which you might think is not the most offensive thing that anyone could possibly call you, right? But Elisha, he definitely takes offense to it, because he calls out a curse upon them, and some bears come out, and they maul, and probably do worse, actually, to this group of lads. And you think, wow, that's pretty harsh, isn't it, for being just calling someone Baldy? So you should be careful what you call them. For those of us who are maybe a little more hair challenged than others of you. But here's the thing, right? They were questioning Elisha as his role as God's prophet. They were questioning Elisha's authority. And ultimately, they were questioning God's authority. We've also talked in this series how Elisha's life is kind of analogous to Jesus' life. And we think of Jesus as being gentle and mild and kind, right? A really nice, gentle person, forgiving. He never cursed anyone, right? When he was hanging on the cross, in his worst moments, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do to me, right? That's kind of the Jesus we often like to think about. But there's a balance there, just like with Elisha, isn't there? Because Jesus could be pretty harsh at times too. Jesus had people that questioned him. Jesus had people that argued against him. Jesus had people that made fun of him. And Jesus constantly warned people about that, didn't he? He said, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words will you be justified, and by your words will be condemned. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? We love John 3:16, John 3:17. We love inviting people into that, don't we? Where Jesus says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And then you can go into 17, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Again, we like inviting people into that season. But we also have to remind people of verse 18 that follows, right? The season that people are already in. Because Jesus says in verse 18 that whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe in him is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. It's not a question of will you be condemned, is it? That's often how we kind of think of that, don't we? That people will be condemned, but that's not what Jesus says. He says, if you have not believed in the name of the Son of God, you are already condemned. That is the season you are in. That's pretty scary, isn't it? That's the season people are in. The scribes one time accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Satan himself. And of course, Jesus questions their whole logic. It's like, well, why would Satan cast out his own people through his power? Because, that would be a kingdom divided, and a kingdom divided will not stand. In fact, Jesus goes on to say that there is only one unforgivable sin, and that is the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And I know we think of, what is that sin? And have I done that? And am I guilty of that right now? And, probably if you're asking that question, you're not, right? Because the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is denying who Jesus is. Because it's the Holy Spirit that guides us, right? And reveals to us who Jesus is. And if you get to the end of your season of life denying that, then you're going to be in trouble. But Jesus gives us the opportunity, doesn't he, of stepping out of the season of condemnation that we find ourselves in through placing our faith and our trust in him into this whole new season of life, this eternal season. So Jesus, like Elisha, he wasn't soft either. He didn't go to the cross because he was soft, did he? Jesus went to the cross because he knew that the only way that we could step out of our season of sin is through him, is through his work on the cross. Because at the end of the day, we've all mocked God, and we've all mocked God's authority. And that's what Elisha understood even before Jesus had come. And he stood in the gap, and he talked about God, and he worked for God, but now it was all coming to an end, and he himself was stepping out. What would come next? I know that most of you prayerfully, hopefully, have a long way to go before you step out of the season of life, right? Although we never exactly know when that's going to come. But it seems to me that life is a series of endings. We're always stepping out of something, right? From when we were a baby, you step out of drinking milk to taking solid foods. You step out of going to kindergarten to going to school to college to a job to, from living in your parents' home to by yourself. It's a series of seasons that we kind of just step out of. The author of Ecclesiastes, that famous passage in chapter 3, right? A time for everything. All different kinds of seasons that he mentions there. Birth to death, planting to plucking, killing to healing, breaking down to building up, weeping to laughing, mourning to dancing. Seasons have beginnings and seasons have endings. Seasons have the time when we step in, and seasons have the time that you step out of. And I just want you to think about the season that you are in right now. Maybe you're just stepping into it, but there will be a time when you get to step out of it as well. And what will that look like? How can you prepare for it? Well, just kind of 2 points this morning to talk about this. I know, only 2, but don't worry, it'll be good. I won't shortchange you. The first is engaged to the end. So we read that Elisha is sick and he's about to die. And the king of Israel comes to visit, and he weeps and cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And you may remember as we stepped into the series that that's exactly what Elisha called out when Elijah was taken up to heaven. Why is the king of Israel calling that out here now? It's hard to know exactly. but I think, what we can say is that the author of Kings is using it as like a literary bookend, right? It bookends Elisha's life and his ministry. And Joash, that's the king of Israel, he's expressing his sorrow. Naturally, he doesn't want Elisha to leave, does he? Elisha is the one who, in some ways, stands in the gap for Israel, right? Without Elisha, as we've seen over the last few weeks, Israel would have been in big, big trouble. And so the king of Israel is definitely upset that Elisha is about to leave because Elisha is sick. And Elisha gives the king of Israel this series of imperatives about opening the window and about shooting an arrow and then taking a load of arrows and striking them on the ground. But for some reason, and Joash doesn't live up to Elisha's expectation, does he? Elisha is expecting Joash to strike these arrows like 5 or 6 times on the ground, and Joash only strikes them like 3 times on the ground. Because it seems like Joash just doesn't quite have the same engagement that Elisha does. And even though Elisha is sick, and even though Elisha is on his deathbed even, he is still just as passionate about the season that God has him in to the very end, isn't he? Some seasons in life, we just can't wait for them to pass. Some seasons we just want to stay in that season as long as we can. But other seasons, we just can't wait for it to be over, right? There's another job I had, not on another nursery, another family nursery. It's funny how these nurseries are all run by families, but that's just the nature of the business, generally speaking. This guy, he was a real micromanager. So I had a job, and I got as a manager, and just really needed the job at the time. And but after, it didn't take me very long, right, to wonder, like, what am I doing here? You hired me as a manager, and yet you want to do all the managing yourself. It's like, what's the point, if you won't release and you won't let go to let me do my job? I'm a firm believer, right, in that if you give somebody a responsibility, you have to give them authority to go with that responsibility. Responsibility without authority is like not responsibility at all, is it? You have to release people in order to do that. But this bloke, well, he didn't want to do that at all. He just didn't trust any of his employees, in fact. And as it turned out, this place was just a difficult place to work at. I also realized that they had a habit of sacking people regularly for no particular reason either. In fact, it was kind of a badge of honor if you got sacked from this nursery. But for whatever reason, I just kind of kept my head down, and the Lord was good to me and protected me. And, I was there for whatever it was, 2 or 3 years, and ended up thinking that a new situation had come about, and handed in my notice. Yes, can't wait to be out of this place, right? Except it didn't turn out quite that way, because the situation that I thought I was going to be going to didn't really materialize not for a while anyway. And so I found myself kind of in limbo. And this nursery hadn't filled my position, and they said, "Hey, would you come back and do like consulting work for us?" I was like, "No." And then I felt like the Lord say, "Brian, I gave you this job when you needed it, and you're not ready to leave yet, so I want you to go back until I say, step out of this season. I want you to stay engaged in this season of life as long as I have you there. And that's a hard place to be sometimes, isn't it? I think of Elisha and his job as being a prophet in Israel. You know, that must have been an extremely difficult work environment for Elisha, right? He must have looked around. He must have looked like south to Judah. Okay, Judah wasn't perfect, right? But Judah was better than Israel. Hey, Lord, how about I go down there and be a prophet down there? Because people actually listen to prophets down there. Why do you have me stuck up here in the north, you know? I mean, they might not be perfect, but at least when you read in the book of Kings, right, a lot of kings in Judah, they did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But this king, the only person, by the way, who's come to mourn, as Elisha with his passing, is a king that did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Not what was good, not even what was half right, but what was evil in the sight of the Lord, is what the author of Kings says. And there's been this long gap also. It's like 50 years, Elisha is an old man here. And since we last heard and talked about Elisha, that was a long time ago. We don't know exactly what he's been up to, but I imagine he's still been engaged all the way through in his prophet calling. And the author of Kings doesn't tell us, because the author of Kings isn't interested particularly in the history of Elisha. The author of Kings is interested in the history of Israel. But what is Elisha leaving behind exactly, There's no mention of school of prophets here anymore. There's no mention of anything. Who is Elisha going to pass his mantle on to? It's like a void, isn't it, right? After a whole lifetime of service, Elisha could just look around and go, I'm just checking out. I'm just going to disengage from all of this. I know where I'm going. I'm all right. You lot can get on with it. But that's not exactly what Elisha does he? I can kind of compare him. You may remember there was another king of Judah this time, a king called Hezekiah. And Hezekiah got sick. And then he prayed, and the Lord gave him another 15 years of life. And then shortly after that, these people from a foreign land came to visit Hezekiah, and Hezekiah showed them all around Jerusalem and the temple and everything, all his treasures. And then they went off, and Isaiah the prophet came along and said, "Hey, Hezekiah, where are those people from?" He goes, I don't know, somewhere like Babylon or somewhere, I think they said they were from. And did you show them all that you had? Yes. Well, you shouldn't have done that, because after you're gone, those people are going to come back and they're going to take everything. And Hezekiah, it says in 2 Kings that Hezekiah thought that the word of the Lord that you've spoken is good, for he thought, why not if there will be peace and security in my days? That just always strikes me as like, what? I'm all right, Jack, right? I'm going to make it through just fine. I don't care about what happens after I shuffle off this mortal coil. After all God had done for him. It just absolutely makes me gobsmacked, frankly. I don't know, maybe you've heard all this talk lately about quiet quitting, right? It's like everywhere. People are talking about quiet quitting and how employees now are just going to do the bare minimum to get by, and as soon as 4 o'clock rolls around, my phone is off or whatever it is, right? So on one hand, it's good, isn't it, that we have healthy work-life boundaries. That's a good thing, I think. But on the other hand, You know, a lot of jobs obviously involve more, in fact, than just, 4 o'clock, turn off my phone, right? And doing the whole quiet quitting thing. And let's face it, it's probably not very satisfying if you have a job that's like that either, is it? Now, I don't know whether quiet quitting is more today than it ever has been. I have no idea, right? Maybe it's easier if you're working remotely, I suppose, that you can do that and get away with it. But probably, maybe it's nothing new either. And then I've been reading about the whole term of quiet quitting being moved into the church as well. And followers of Jesus disengaging as well. And again, we could say, well, you could do that remotely too, right? Because you can watch a service remotely. You can disengage yourself, and it's easier, right? And of course, we have to be careful here because God is not our employer, and we're not trying to earn our way to heaven. We're not on a contract. We live by grace. So let's not make that mistake. And there are seasons of life too where, we're going to be more engaged. It's just possible for us to be more engaged than at other times. But yet we have this kind of mentality built into us, don't we? That we work for a season, and then we get to an end of a season and we step out and we retire, and then we can do whatever we like, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole mentality that we have. John Piper, he tells this story that kind of profoundly actually affected me when I heard it, about a couple who retire and they move to Florida and they spend their time on their yacht or walking along the beach picking up seashells, right? And he says, what are they going to do when they get to heaven? What are they going to show Jesus? Their collection of seashells? Look what we've been doing here on earth. And again, I understand that maybe a lot of you are a long way from that, but nonetheless, it's that whole mentality that gets built into us in our culture, isn't it? That at some point, we can all disengage and check out and go and do whatever it is that we want. Jesus told a story, a parable about a man who went away to a far country, and he left his 3 servants with some different amounts of money, 5 talents and 2 talents and 1 talent. And then he went off. And the first 2, when he came back, he called for the servants to come and give account of what they'd done with their talents. And the first 2 came back, and they'd invested what they'd been given, and they doubled it, right? And he said, well done, good and faithful servant. Come in. And then the third one came back, and you may remember that he kind of quite quit, hadn't he? He'd taken his talent, and he'd buried it in his back garden. And why had he done that? Well, this particular man had done it because he said that he was fearful, right? Sometimes we can check out and disengage because we're fearful. We see the world around us, and we look at the world around us, and we go, I think I'll just check out of this. But we can check out for other reasons as well. Sometimes we check out because we think that we know it all already, right? Okay, I know everything that I need to know. Or we think that, you know what, I've done my part, it's somebody else's time now. It's done my fair share, somebody else can take over. Sometimes we do it because we get apathetic. Sometimes we do it because it's hard and it's difficult, and the season that we are in, we don't want to go on anymore, right? I mean, I think of Job and his wife Why don't you just curse God and die and be over and done with it, right? But Job refused to do that, even though he hung on to that season with his fingernails, clinging to faith, yet he stayed engaged to the end, didn't he? Because he wanted to get to God. He wanted to find out, he wanted to present his case to God. I love this church because everyone is so engaged in this church. And that's just a beautiful thing. And I just love being part of this church because everyone is so engaged in this church. Nobody is quite quitting whatsoever. And that's not to say we don't want to burn people out here, right? We want to have a nice, healthy balance, right? But I love Garden Church because everyone is engaged. And as we kick off the new season of life groups last week, it was just so great to see how many people come to that. And if you're not in one, there's still lots of time to come along. So we can talk about that in a bit later. But staying engaged in the season that God has us in is really a matter of focus, isn't it? Peter says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So are you fully engaged and focused in the season that God has you in right now? And secondly, not only is Elisha engaged to the end, but he also exceeds the end. Come to this funny little story now where Elisha dies, he's buried, and sometime later somebody else is having a funeral, and it's interrupted by this band of Moabites marauding into Israel, and seems like they hastily throw his body into Elisha's grave, and his body touches Elisha's bones, and he comes back to life. And even though Elisha stepped out of this world, he's shuffled off this mortal coil, and yet he's still bringing people back to life. Wow. Generally speaking, when you leave a job, right, that's it, right? You leave it behind, adios, bye-bye. You don't have any more input into the life of that position, do you? In fact, those people that come after you, they don't want you having any input into it either, right? They don't need your ghost hanging around them doing that. And even like when it comes to the point of us actually dying and leaving this earth, I've heard and actually known a couple of people who have tried from the grave to manage people's lives, leaving their inheritance, but it's based on, you get my inheritance if you do certain things to qualify, right? If you marry the right person, if you stay in the family trade, if you live in the right location. That's such a terrible thing to do, by the way. You can't manage from beyond the grave like that. When you step out, you kind of give up control. But it doesn't mean that when we step out of a season, we can't leave something life-giving behind us. Because we can, can't we? When we step out of a season, we can exceed our time by leaving something life-giving behind us. I mean, just think of the story I told you about Mr. Van Delft. He left something life-giving for me all my life long. And it's not just a vocation, is it? We can step out of a season and we can leave. People have left us music and literature and all kinds of things they've left behind that we get to benefit from their lives. It doesn't even have to be a great long legacy, does it? Maybe just a cheery good morning. And that touches someone. We've left that moment long behind, but that cheery good morning that we gave to that person on the street just stayed with them for the rest of their day. We have this opportunity, don't we, where we can leave behind something that exceeds that season that we are in. In 12 hours or so, whatever it is, this day is going to be gone. This season, it will never come back again. But that doesn't mean that today we can't leave something behind that will continue on into the future in somebody's life, in this community's life even. The greatest thing that we can do, in fact, is to exceed our season by sharing our faith, isn't it? By telling people about Jesus. Elisha has long exceeded his season, hasn't he? Here we are, 2,500 years later, still talking about what God did through Elisha. And we can read our Bibles, and there's a whole host of names where God has used those seasons, right? And it exceeds way past those lives that God still talks as we, think about Abraham and Moses and David and Rahab and Ruth and all these people in the Bible who are by no means perfect. And yet God uses those seasons of life to speak to us today. All of them exceeding. And that's what he's still doing today. He can use this season, right now, this day, the 25th of September 2022, to extend way beyond that through us. But it points to the one person the only person who can bring back people from the dead, and that's Jesus Christ. The author of Hebrews, he sums it up this way. He says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." Jesus is the one that exceeds everything. But us, when we live our lives in faith, we too can point to that beyond the season of our lives to Jesus Christ. So we've reached the end of our series, Standing in the Gap, and we've come to that last part where we're stepping out now. But the question is, what will we leave behind? And will we stay engaged all the way to the end of the season that God has us in right now? And then, will we exceed the season that God has us in right now? Daniel's going to come up and we're going to play another worship song. We have the elements of communion, the bread and the juice on the table. During the song, I just invite you to go and grab the juice and the bread and then bring it back to your chair.